Collaboration is one aspect of software development that I feel does not happen enough in education. The days of like the wizard in the basement who just builds all this crazy stuff that you use are gone, long gone. Like their software is collaborative. And in education, I feel like you end up turning in an assignment and you're not supposed to talk to other people. And that just doesn't happen in the real world. You talk to other people all the time. There are aspects of GitHub that run that I'm not scared of it, but I have coworkers that I just say, you understand that really well, and I trust that you know it, and if I need to integrate with it, we're gonna talk about it. But I don't care about the low-level, like, underlying Ruby implementation and how you're optimizing the garbage collector. Like, that's just things I don't care about. But collaboration is a day-to-day thing in every shop right now. Everybody I know, whether you're in a big corporate environment, whether you're in a startup, anything, like you work with other people. It's rare that one person does everything anymore. And contemporary software is like, it's just collaborating. Like you have things like peer review, and you learn how to have design decision discussions. You learn about testing and deployment, and all of these things end up reaching most of the team. And it's actually, it's very different than anything I was ever shown. Like we had software development classes, and we had like, oh, you're gonna work on a team and you're going to have requirements documents and things like that. But the way that real software is built was nothing like I was taught. And one of the cool things with basically, collaborating is when you work with other people, you're exposed to crazy new things. Like we do a lot of pair programming, and I sit next to somebody, and you can only watch someone else use that text editor without like code completion long enough before you go hit escape. It's like, just hit escape. And you kind of mumble it at first, and then you're like, hit escape. And they're like, why would I hit escape? And I'm like, because you're typing a 40-line method, or a 40-line method name, and if you just hit escape, it's just gonna auto-complete it. Save yourself some keystrokes. And there's all these little things like, oh, here's how to be like a shell ninja, where it's like, I'm really good at the bash shell now because I sat next to someone else and was like, how'd you do that? And those things I feel like are missing. The other thing that I think is very different now is teams are geographically distributed. I've been in industry for about 7 years. I've never worked at a company where everybody was in the same office. And I think that that's going to be more and more common. Basically, teams are more distributed. People need to have really good communication skills. You need to be able to communicate both verbally and written. And as teams start to be more and more disconnected, you need to be able to communicate effectively with people in order to run smoothly. I ended up working with a guy from New Zealand for almost 2 years. And I was in Boulder, Colorado at the time, and he was in New Zealand. And we were basically tasked with a whole bunch of internal software projects at the company we worked at. And so we used a combination of Skype and this program called Screen, so we could look at the same editor at the same time, and we could talk about the software. And it was really difficult to not be in the same room and collaborate on software with somebody, but once we got the hang of it, it was amazing, because you could just hear, like I could hear him sigh, and I was just like, oh yeah, you don't like that method name, do you? And he's like, no, can I change it? But you start to get that, that knowledge of each other that's really interesting, and it's crazy because he was half the world away. And we offset our sleep cycles and work times so we had more overlap, but it was like, we worked together about 4.5, 5 hours a day, and I had like 2 hours in the morning before he came on, and he had 2 hours after I logged off to really manage all of the other things. But I feel like if you can work with people all over the world, you're setting yourself up for a whole lot more success. And the other thing is that coding's social. This is basically a lot of the early adopters of Ruby on Rails. And so we had all worked together for the better part of a year before there was ever a Ruby on Rails conference. And when we all showed up, it was like, oh, there's a person behind that IRC name. It was amazing. And we all hung out, and if I had time, I could go through and there's 5 or 6 amazing startups that have been founded based on that group alone. And all we did was have this collaborative passion around the Ruby on Rails bandwagon when it started. Large projects, we use this kind of ideal at GitHub because the large projects end up being social. Like Ruby on Rails is hosted on GitHub, jQuery, Node.js, all these things that are very popular and things that build up a whole bunch of momentum end up being powered by the people who are involved. And it's not just that the technology is compelling, it's that the ecosystem around those languages that are being created is also compelling. And once users begin to interact with each other, you start to see that it's actually open source and coding itself can basically be a meritocracy. Like, you can be extremely critical of somebody's opinions, and you can be extremely critical of someone's implementation, but they're telling you that because they want the best stuff, and they know that things can be better. And it's pretty amazing. That group photo still cracks me up. But so collaboration is extremely important. The other thing that I think students can benefit from is reputation management. In this kind of crazy social media culture that's kind of blown up the last few years, I think students and graduates need a way to stand out. It's not enough to just have a degree. You need to be like, I have a degree and I've done all these other things. And unfortunately, it's not just what you know, it's actually who you know sometimes too. And I think that as educators, I wish that there would be more encouragement to get people involved. It's basically, something as simple as like get a Bitbucket or GitHub account. Sign up for something that is collaborative, because that's kind of the way software works. And it's like, just push them a little bit so they get going. And I'm still unsure how to do labs. Like, my CS labs were kind of crazy because it was basically like learning this syntax. And once you get past learning this syntax, there's just a whole, there's a huge number of things that you can do, but I wish that education worked more like open source projects. That you had a few people that you were working on something with, and in the end, you just kind of showed it and everything was cool. But the other thing is, I think that having students read code is extremely beneficial. Most people don't read code until, they're basically forced to. And a lot of really, really smart people have written really good code that if you sit down and read through it, you're like, man, I never would have done it that way, but I see why they did it. And I know where I can apply a similar, approach in my own projects. The other thing that I wish that educators would kind of push for would be to travel. Because if you go out and you meet people, sometimes you kind of just, you meet so many amazing people that you wouldn't if you stay inside your own community. Open source conferences are a great place to meet other passionate people in the areas that you're interested in. There are free conferences available. This one is free to students. I think that's awesome. There's a few others that I'll mention in a minute. But what's cool is, like, you can learn about emerging tech, but you also get to meet other people who might want to hire you. And you need to know that there are a lot of jobs out there, but they just might not be where you live right now. And you could either work remote, or if it's an amazing place, like, you might want to move there. And that might be a really cool way to get a change of pace in your life. But traveling and meeting other people is definitely cool. And as a result, you end up with building up your reputation, management, because you basically, you meet people and you have FaceTime with them and you learn about, silly stuff like, where they live or how many kids they have and stuff like that. Ruby Summer of Code is something one of my former employers was putting on for a while. Google Summer of Code, Ruby Hoedown is a free conference. There are a lot of things if you just look. And I remember being an extremely broke student, and they were like, no, I can't pay $500 for a conference. That's unreasonable. But if you look, there are people trying to give you money to work on open source. And there are conferences that you don't have to pay a dime to go to, and you just need to head out. One of the other things that I actually like about the Ruby Summer of Code and the Google Summer of Code is that they do mentors, and they require the students usually to do a summary of the changes that they made. And those types of tasks it's not just enough to go and do some hacks. Like, you need to sit down and say, I'm doing these hacks for these reasons, and this was the end result. And I think that's very good for people who are kind of just coming out of education and trying to kind of get their foot in. But the reality is that it's the student's responsibility to put forth effort. As much as you kind of push them to try all these things, they need to try. Recommendations are great from your educators when you get out of school, but it doesn't help if people are basing things solely on experience. But working in open source and doing all of these things is basically, collegiate extracurricular activities. You're like, I do all these things, and it makes you stand out. And it can be really, really rewarding. But you basically have to practice. Like you don't get a CS degree and become a good developer. You become a good developer by writing a lot of code and being really bad at it for a number of years.